Hello everyone. In this presentation, we're going to cover the synovial joints, which is the last of the three different types of joints based on the structure. The other two were the fibrous and the cartilaginous joints that were covered in a different PowerPoint presentation. The main structure that differentiates the synovial joint from the other joints is the presence of this space between the bones that is called the synovial cavity, or also the joint cavity. None of the other joints have a space between them. This space is important because it will allow this type of joint to be more movable than the other joints in the body. In fact, the synovial joints between the carpal bones have very limited movement, but the shoulder joint can move more freely in all directions. Also, this synovial cavity is going to be surrounded by a connective tissue capsule that will attach the articulating bones, and we will talk more about this in the upcoming slides. Right over here, you can see where the synovial cavity is located within this joint. This cavity will contain a fluid that is called the synovial fluid. So see, not everything is complicated in anatomy. We will talk in more details about the synovial joint in the next slide. On this slide, I want you to see in details that this synovial joint will also contain what we call the articular capsule, not to confuse with the articular cartilage present right over here. As we know, the articular cartilage will be located at the end of the long bones where they will articulate with other bones, and this smooth cartilage will cover the articulating surfaces, but as you can see, there's a space between the bones, so it does not bind the two bones together. This articular cartilage is going to be important to reduce the friction between the bones, especially during movement, and it will also help to absorb shock, especially during running and jumping. Now let's go here to the articular capsule. As you can see, it is made up of two membranes, an outer membrane that's called the fibrous membrane, and an inner one that's called the synovial membrane. So remember, the inner is going to be in contact with the synovial fluid, and therefore it's called the synovial membrane. Now, this outer fibrous membrane will be made up of a dense, irregular connective tissue, mostly made up of collagen fibers, and you can see how it will continue with the periosteum, which, if you guys remember, is going to be that membrane that covers the outer surface of the bone. Now, the flexibility of the fibrous membrane will permit a considerable movement at a joint, and its great tensile strength, because it's made up of collagen fibers, is going to make it resistant to stretching, which will also help prevent the bones from dislocating. On the other hand, the synovial membrane, which is the inner one, is going to be composed of a thin layer of synovial cells on the surface, and underneath these cells, there's going to be a layer of areolar connective tissue together with elastic fibers. In the next slide, we will cover a few more characteristics of the synovial joint. This inner membrane that we were talking about on the previous slide, which is the synovial membrane, will be the one responsible for the secretion of the synovial fluid. And this synovial fluid will form this thin film over the surfaces within the articular capsule. This fluid will consist of hyaluronic acid, which will also be secreted by the synovial cells, in addition to an interstitial fluid that will be filtered from the blood plasma. In terms of function of the synovial fluid, it will help with the reduction of friction by lubricating the joints. It will help in absorbing shocks as it serves as a cushion. It will supply oxygen and nutrients to the chondrocytes that are going to be present within this articular cartilage. And it will also remove the carbon dioxide and the metabolic waste. And you can be asking yourself, why is it that the synovial fluid is doing the function of the blood vessels? Well, remember that the cartilage is an avascular tissue, meaning that it does not have blood vessels. Therefore, you need another structure to make sure this tissue is healthy. Not only that, but the synovial fluid will contain these phagocytic cells that are important for the removal of microbes and debris that eventually appear from your daily wear and tear of the joint. In fact, when a synovial joint is immobile for a time, the fluid becomes quite viscous, like a gel-like structure, but as the joint movement increases, the fluid becomes less viscous, more liquidy. One of the benefits of exercise warm-ups is that they will stimulate the production and secretion of the synovial fluid, and within limits, more fluid means less stress on the joints during exercise. This is also important as you get older, you tend to move less and you start to have pains in your joints. However, as we can clearly see, the more you move, the better it is for your joints. Many synovial joints will also contain what we call accessory ligaments that are going to be called extracapsular ligaments and intracapsular ligaments. Like the name says, extracapsular ligaments are going to lie outside the articular capsule, such as the ones we see here, which are the fibular and the tibiocollateral ligaments of the knee. As you can see, they're on the outside of the capsule. And the intracapsular ligaments are going to occur within the articular capsule, but are going to be excluded from the synovial cavity by folds of the synovial membrane. And there are two that we can talk about, which are the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments of the knee joint, and those will be covered later on in this module. A few synovial joints in the body will also contain what it's called articular discs, and these discs are going to be made up of fibrocartilage structures that are not covered by the synovial membrane and that will divide the synovial cavity into two smaller cavities. As you will see later when we cover the specific joints, that there are going to be movements that occur independently in each of these divided cavities. For example, in the temporomandibular joint, which is the joint between the temporal bone and the mandible. In other words, between the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone and the mandibular condyle of the mandible. But now here in the knee joint, we will find these incomplete discs that will therefore only partially divide the joint, and these are called the menisci. As we can see from this image, we're going to have two, one on the medial side and one on the lateral side. With regards to function, they're not very well understood, but it is known to include the following, which are absorbing shock. It will also allow a better fit between the articulating surfaces of the bone. It will provide this adaptable surface for combined movements, depending on the type of joint and what movement they're able to perform. It will also be important to distribute the weight over a greater contact surface. And lastly, it will be important because it will allow the distribution of the synovial lubricant across the articular surface of the joint.